I hear the sound of an army arising. I hear the sound of an army arising. I hear the sound of an army arising. In place, say I hear the sound of an army arising. I hear the sound of an army arising. The price is rising.
Good evening and welcome to New Life Church Virtual Worship Center, now Bible study, where we delve into God's Word to study to show ourselves approved and workmen that needs not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. We thank you for joining in and being engaged and involved in the study of God's Word. So let us have a word of prayer. God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for every participant on the line today. We pray that it will be a blessing today as we will not only be hearers of your word, but be doers as well. We thank you for this day. We thank you for strengthening us and guiding us. On the line today, we pray that it will be a blessing today. We will not only be hearers of your word, but this is our prayer. In Jesus' name. Again, we thank you for sharing today as we open God's Word. We, within the next week, or weeks ahead of us, we will be looking at an Old Testament book and studying, and we'll get some material out to you. We're going to look at the book of Esther. Esther is a narrative list, the book of Esther in the Old Testament. And when you have time, you can turn there. But tonight I'll be doing pretty much a historical background, giving us some information leading up to the book of Esther. And you can jot down some notes as we tread upon this book in the weeks ahead of us. The book pretty much the book of Esther. Let me give you some information on background information on the book of Esther. We are aware that the author of the book is unknown. It is possible to make inferences about the author and date of the composition, but no one really knows who wrote the book of Esther. Some scholars attribute it to Mordecai, Ezra, or Nehemiah as writers of this book, but no one really knows who is the writer of this book. It is clear that the author was a Jew, both from his emphasis on the origin of the Jewish festival and from the Jewish nationalism that permeates throughout this narrative or story. So the author, we know, is a Jew, but we don't know who this author was, but we have reference here throughout this story that he is a Jew. The author have knowledge of Persian customs. The setting of the story is in the city of Susa, and the absence of any reference to conditions of circumstances in the land of Judah suggests that he was a resident of a Persian city. So we see that the author is a Jew and he has Persian customs, but not knowing who this individual was. The earliest date for the book would be shortly after the events narrated 460 BC. It was before Ezra's return to Jerusalem. And it also suggests that internal evidence also to suggest that the festival of Purim is evident in this book, Purim, had been observed for some time prior to the actual writing of this book. And you can find this in chapter 9, verse 19, and verse 19 of the book of Esther. So there are a lot of festivals and banquets going on in this book. And one of the main ones is the Festival of Purim. And you can find this in chapter 9, verse 19. Esther name. What is the meaning of Esther? Her name. And it is Hadassah. Hadassah. And it's found in the second chapter, verse 7, Hadassah. It means myrtle. Turn over there to chapter 2, verse 7, and you will find this reference here. Chapter 2, verse 7. And it reads like this: Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. And this young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. So we found reference here in chapter 2, verse 7, that Hadassah means myrtle, was the Hebrew name of Esther, which came either from Persian word star or possibly from the name of Babylonian love goddess Ishtar. So her name, Esther, means Hadassah, means myrtle, or a Persian word star, or possibly from the name of Babylonian love goddess Ishtar. Esther grew up in Persia with her older cousin Mordecai, we see here, who raised her as if she was his own daughter. So she was raised by Mordecai because her mother and father had died. Some purposes and themes and literary features in this book. Purposes, themes, and literary features. So the author's central purpose was to record the institution of this big annual festival of Purim, and to keep alive for later generations the memory of the great deliverance of the Jewish people from the reign of Xerxes. Xerxes. Capital Xerxes. Xerxes. So the author's central theme here was to record the institution of the annual festival of Purim, and to keep alive for later generations the memory of this great deliverance of the Jewish people during the reign of Xerxes. And we know in this story, there is an ongoing conflict, contention between Israel and the Amalekites. A conflict that began during Exodus and continued through Israel's history. As the first to attack Israel after their deliverance from Egypt, the Amalekites. Amalekites were viewed, and the author of Esther views them as the epitome of all powers of the world arrayed against God's people. So the Amalekites were their enemies. They were always in contention, ongoing contention and conflict with Israel, the Amalekites. Now that Israel has been from captivity, Haman is another central figure in this book. Is the final major effort in the Old Testament to destroy them. So again, Amalekites and Haman here is this main event for them to destroy the Amalekites. Now again, feasting, having a multiple feasts is another prominent theme in Esther. Big banquets provide the setting for important plots and developments. There are 10 banquets represented in Esther. 10 banquets. So there's a lot of feasting going on. There are a lot of big parties or banquets that's thrown in this book of Esther. We have in the book of Esther, you have 2 lists of the king's servants. We have 2 fasts that's going on. And we have fastings, as we said, we have banquets, and we have festivals going on in the book of Esther. I think that's important to highlight because we will find that in threaded throughout this book. 10 banquets, as I said, represented in the book of Esther. Now, you will be surprised, you probably already know, is that there is no mention, this is the only book in the Bible that there is no mention of God in this book. God is nowhere referenced in the book of Esther. There is no worship. There is no prayer of sacrifice going on in Esther. Some say that it is pretty much secular and has no religious value, but we will find out that the providence of God, God's hand, is moving on in every scene in the book of Esther. So there is no mention of God, no worship, and no prayer of sacrifice. And some have said, as I said earlier, as a secular or has no religious value. And even if the writer does not mention the name of God or any religious activity, it is, as I say, it is threaded throughout the book that God is the one who is orchestrating, moving and navigating behind the scenes, that he is evident that God is threaded throughout this book, but not his name. His name is not mentioned. God is sovereign, and we can note that it is divine providence, the divine providence of God. And when we're talking about God's divine providence, God intervening in the universe. God intervening in the universe. And oftentimes is used as a title of God, the providence of God, the divine providence of God, God's intervention in the world. Please note another theme here, God working through events and circumstances are fully within God's providence. God working through events and circumstances are fully within God's providence. Another thing, reversal and irony are evidence of God's hand in a book in which he is never mentioned by name. Reversal and irony are evidence of God's hand is in a book in which he is never mentioned by his name, which says God has a plan in the midst of events, circumstances, and through people. God has a divine plan in the midst of circumstances, events, and people, he can turn things around again for his good and for his glory. And all things do work together for the good of them who love the Lord, are called according to his purpose or purposes. It becomes clear to the careful reader that Israel's great king exercises his providential and sovereign control of all the vicissitudes of for this covenant people. So we know that in this particular book of Esther, Xerxes is the king. He is well known to history, though more commonly known under the name, as I said, Xerxes. He inherited the vast Persian empire from his father Darius, who is mentioned in various passages. Ezra 4:24, Ezra 5:5 through 7, and Ezra 6:1 through 15. He inherited the vast Persian empire from his father Darius, Xerxes. Find that in the book of Esther. In those days when King Xerxes sat on the throne of his kingdom, at the same time Xerxes was planning for a doomed invasion of Greece, which would take place several years later. At this time, the city of Athens was in its classical glory, and in Greece, they were celebrating the 79th Olympic Games. In those days, in which King Xerxes sat on the throne of his kingdom, at this time, Xerxes was planning for a doomed invasion of Greece, which would take place several years later. And at this time, the city of Athens was in its classical glory, and in Greece, they were celebrating the 79th Olympic Games. So that's some history that I think it's important to lift up at this time. This 79th Olympic Games was celebrating at this time. So that's a little background on the book of Esther, and we'll go into it later with some more insight as we travel through on the weeks before. We'll delve in tonight at a couple of verses. We won't get too far in, but we're going to start out in looking at chapter 1, which sets the theme for this plot for Esther. And I'm asking my sister Angela to read for us verse 1 and 2.
Esther 1, verses 1 through 2. From his royal throne in Persia's capital city of Susa, King Xerxes ruled 127 provinces, all the way from India to Ethiopia.
Verse 2.
And okay, and was that verse 1 through 2?
That was just verse 1.
Okay. In the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his officials and administrators. The army of Persia and Media were present, as well as the governors and noblemen of the provinces.
Yeah. So it's right from the beginning. It said now tell them the power and influence of this of Xerxes, the one in charge at this time. It says he ruled over, look, 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. That's a huge territory that he is over at this time. At this time, the Persian Empire was the largest the world had ever seen. It covered what we call today Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Jordan, and Lebanon, and Israel, and also parts of the modern day Egypt, Sudan, Libya, and Arabia. So look at this huge territory that King Xerxes is reigning over or sat on the throne of at this time. 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. And he was ruled over these provinces at this time. So it's note the power and the influence of Xerxes at this time. Also at this time, Ezra had returned to Jerusalem after it had been conquered by the Babylonians. So Ezra had returned to Jerusalem as it has been conquered by the Babylonians. The temple had been rebuilt 30 years before, although more simply and without the glory of Solomon's temple. So 30 years before, the temple had been built some 30 years before, although more simply and without the glory of Solomon's temple. So we can see that Xerxes is reigning over these provinces. He has a lot of power. He has a lot of influence. And Ezra had returned to Jerusalem after it had been conquered by the Babylonians, and the temple had been rebuilt some 30 years before. And also another important point to note, in 40 years under the successor of Xerxes, Nehemiah would return to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls of this previously conquered city. We did a study weeks ago when we were talking about Lamentations, and the city was in ruins and it needed to be rebuilt. And Nehemiah is the one we felt led to come back and rebuild the city. So we can see again from verse 1 and 2, that gives us some background on Xerxes, how he ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. And at that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the city of Susa, which you know this is a Persian setting. And in the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet. We talked about banquet. There are 10 banquets in Esther for all his nobles and officials. We would call this his cabinet. He threw this big banquet for his cabinet members, his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. So this was a well-to-do or well-attended banquet by officials, nobles, military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and nobles of the provinces were present. So this was a great banquet. And we see what went on in this banquet. We have us read for me verses 4 through 7. Sister Regina, Sister Catherine.
Yes.
Verses 4 through
4 through 7.
yes.
The celebration lasted 6 months, a tremendous display of the wealth and glory of his empire. When it was all over, the king gave a special party for the palace servants and officials, janitors and cabinet officials alike, for 7 days of revelry held in the courtyard of the palace garden. The decorations were green, white, and blue, fastened with purple ribbons tied to silver rings embedded in marble pillows. Gold and silver benches stood on pavements of black, red, and white and yellow marble. Drinks were served in gold goblets of many designs, and there was an abundance of royal wine, for the king was feeling very generous.
Wow. This was some kind of banquet, wasn't it? Look,
Yes.
look at look at where it was going. It lasted for a full 180 days, 6 months. He through this displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting, look, 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. So I think your translation, Sister Catherine, adds some clarity to even the janitors. Everybody, they were invited, all over the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa in this area of Persia. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. While he laid it out for this banquet and all this feast, he was generous. And look at verse 7. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other. And the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality or generosity. So again, we see Xerxes showing off his wealth, the splendor of the riches of the kingdom, lasting 180 days. He made a feast for all his officials and servants. The king made a feast lasting 7 days here for all the people who was present at Susan, the citadel. And the second feast was for the citizens of the capital city, Susan, and it lasted for 7 days, as we said. The basic reason for these feasts was, of course, he wanted to show off his wealth, and this was pride. The king wanted to impress his subjects with a great display of his own wealth, power, majesty, and generosity. Again, he wanted to show people how wealthy he was, how generous he was, how much in power he was, and the majesty of his of sitting on the throne at this time. This is a typical way that the rulers of Gentiles lord over them, and those who are in great authority over there, have great authority over them. You can have reference to this. Look at Matthew 20, verse 25, for reference how typical how the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them. There is little doubt that Xerxes paid for the feast out of the public treasury. And look at this. There were white and blue linen curtains set there. And in ancient Hebrew, the white material is literally described as white stuff. This may be evidence that Esther was written with a man's eye or a man's perspective for decorating detail, not a woman's eye. So again, this was known as white stuff, the white material, again, for the linen. In accordance with the law, drinking was not compulsory. Among some of the ancients, each guest was obliged to have a drink with the current round or else leave the party. Again, so that you could imagine there was a lot of individuals intoxicated as the party. They would drink as much as they wanted. And at the second feast, the king commanded that each man could drink as he pleased. So it was wide open. Again, as they were drinking wine given by King Xerxes. So this was a major party. You can imagine that there was a lot of drinking going on, intoxication at this party. And let's see what goes on next in our text. Verse 8 through verse 10. Sister Margaret. Probably be the sister. Verse 8. Let me read that for you. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restriction. For the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Verse 9. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet. And this was his wife, Queen Vashti, also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of the king. So there were a couple of banquets going on at this time. And verse 10, on the seventh day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits, meaning probably intoxicated from the wine, he commanded 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehuman, Bista, Habona, Victor, Abagatha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. So Queen, and let me finish reading that. But when the attendants delivered the king's command to Queen Vashti refused to come, then the king became furious and burned with anger. Wow. So again, in the midst of all of this partying, generosity, him being empowered and having his ego, he calls for Queen Vashti to appear before drunken guests at the feast in verse 12. But notice here, I want to get comments after this, but Queen Vashti refused to come. Though Vashti was by no means a follower of a true God, she had enough wisdom and modesty to know that this was something she would not do. Notice the the king, Xerxes, one in charge, got his officials to go and get Vashti to come in, and he wanted to parade her before the drunken guests. Probably with no clothes on, but she refused. She refused the king's request. And we don't often we talk about Esther, but why not give Vashti, Queen Vashti, some accolades for refusing to be paraded before drunken individuals? Look at the backlash that she would probably get for refusing the king's request. I think she should be lifted up as a trailblazer for refusing to come in. Let's open this up and get some comments about Queen Vashti. And what would be some comments and the pressure she was under at this time from Xerxes the king and the public officials to petition her to come in before drunken individuals and parade her because of her beauty, and she refused to come in. Let me give some comments or some feedback on Queen Vashti at this time. Sister Angela.
I think she had some dignity about herself.
Right.
And respect for herself. I'm just trying to picture the scene, and she didn't want to be she knew everybody was drunken and husband was drunk. I mean, king was drunk.
Yeah.
Almost remind me of, I hate to say it, but a strip club almost.
Right.
And she coming in, and she everybody in there drunk, and she up, she coming out just exploiting herself. She has some dignity and pride about herself. She didn't want to participate in the nonsense.
What do you think the backlash was for that?
Oh, I know, like I said, the king was furious. He was angry. But she didn't want to be a spectacle.
Yeah. And didn't want to, again, it was like a sign of disrespect for the king, right?
Yes, because the king gets what he wants.
That's right. And he got
People
all
bow the power, the
power,
authority,
influence, and everything.
Yep, and what he says goes.
Right.
So she probably she got some backlash for not coming out and exploiting herself for her beauty.
Angela, what kind of tell me what kind of accolades should we be lifting up about Queen Vashti and why she is a trailblazer, considered a trailblazer?
I never thought about when you said that. I was trying to think about that because she set a standard,
She set a standard. And even though she listen, even though again she didn't follow, and we don't know what her religious persuasion was, what type of God she was following, but she did have some dignity about herself, and she didn't know what was right or wrong.
And she said, "I'm not just going to do this just because he wants me to do it."
Right.
It's almost remind me of Daniel not bowing down, and eating the food. Sometimes you gotta set a standard.
You gotta set a standard. Even in the midst of a king.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. She set a standard. Sister Catherine.
Mm-hmm. Girl power. I admire her for taking a stand. You know,
Me too.
before drunken men. I mean, she was doing well at her own party.
That's right. That's right. That's her own body. And she
Yeah.
probably had weapons well, but this was in that particular. And we always let me always keep this in mind when we're reading Esther and we're reading most of a lot of the authors. A lot of times it's written is male dominated. Uh, it's a patriarchal society at this time. And whatever the man says go, it goes. So when you're going against an individual who have all this power and authority and this wealth and he's sitting on the throne and you say no, and that's some power in itself. And what I want to say, the power, if I was preaching this, of the power to say no when you're under pressure to do some things that's not pleasing in the sight of God. Sister, let me see what Sister Margaret has to say if she's on the line.
I don't think she can hear you.
Okay.
I'm on the line, but you can't hear me.
I mean, she
you.
can't. Yeah, she can't hear. Yeah, you can't hear her.
Okay.
Go ahead, Sister Margaret. We can hear you.
Yeah, can you?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, what is your question again,
I
please?
was asking the what are you thinking about why when Vashti was ordered to come and down this red carpet before drunken banqueters, and she refused to do it, even at the king's request. Look how empowered she was to do that, and how she took a stand and should be considered a trailblazer for even for women.
Well, she was a great woman and she thinks that she can do whatever she feels like doing by making a banquet with all the nobles. And in fact, give them drink. They were drinking as much as they can. She was a noble woman, yeah.
Yeah. And that empowerment by just taking a stand and let me say what I just thought about, she had courage.
Yeah.
She was brave.
And she thinks highly of herself.
What did she say? What did you say, Sister Margaret?
And she thinks highly of herself.
She thought highly of herself.
Yes.
And she was bold. She was bold.
Bold.
Yes.
Yeah, she took a stand. She don't care. I don't care how much money you got, King. I don't care how many provinces you over. I'm not coming in. And all of this, and we'll see later on, is a setup for something God moving, some moving around, some moving pieces in the puzzle to get Esther where she needs to be. So Queen Vashti refused to come before the banqueter. The king was furious and he burned with anger. Queen Vashti was therefore in a very dangerous situation. It does not seem that she put herself in this situation because it seems that she was not even at this banquet. She didn't even come in. Didn't step a foot in the banquet. She was brave and took a stand. Go, Vashti. Go. Amen. Girl power. Thank you, Sister.
Amen.
Sister Catherine. Thank you, Sister Margaret. Thank you, Sister Andrew, about she took pride in herself.
Yep.
And she was brave and courageous to do what's right, not in the sight of this king, but again, She had pride in doing what's right for herself. Verse 13. Somebody, Sister Angela, start with verse 13 and read down to about verse 15.
Okay, 13. Now it was the king's custom to ask for expert opinion on questions of law and order. So he called for his advisors who would know what should be done.
Wow.
Those who most often turned to for advice were Kashima, Shita, Admatha, Tashish, Meres, Marcina, and Memucan.
And a
Khan.
court system like judges and all these around them. All right.
7 officials of Persia and Media who held the highest offices in the kingdom. He said to these men, I, King Xerxes, sent my servants to Queen Vashti with a command, and she refused to obey it. What does the law say that we should do with her?
Wow.
It's getting real.
What the law says. Let's see what the law says. Say he pulled all his top officials together. Say, come on, let's have a conference and see what the law says and what we're gonna do to Queen Vashti. Let's see what we do. Sister Catherine, read, starting with the pick it up and going on to the end of the chapter.
She stopped at 15?
Yeah.
Okay. Verse 16. Memucan answered for the elders. King Vashti was wronged, not only the king. I read that. Memucan answered for the others. Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but every official and citizen of your empire. For the women everywhere
she's
will
the
begin
best
to
representation for the
yeah.
king.
So she set an example. He's saying that you know, the other women that do this, they do the same thing. Verse 17.
Right.
For women everywhere will begin to disobey their husbands when they learn about Queen Vashti had done. And before this day is out, the wife of every one of us officials throughout your empire will hear what the queen did and will start talking to us husbands the same way. And there will be contempt and anger throughout your realm.
Stop right there, Sister Catherine. Stop right there. Stop right there for 1 minute. Now, remember the mindset, as I said, of this society at this time. Women didn't have a voice. Do what I say, and that's it. Or you will be considered as blackballed or like a leper because you did not do what the king says do, and laws were written again for those in power. So at this time, Queen Vashti stood up, even though the law said she was wrong. Y'all think about that.
Yeah.
Right, Sister Catherine?
Yep.
What's your thoughts on that, Sister Catherine, before we move forward?
Well, I say kudos to her. Yeah. I mean, who wants to do, you know, parade yourself in front of drunkards? That's what they were.
Yeah.
So she took a stand for, you know, for the ladies, you know.
That's right. And she took again. She took a stand, and she took the backlash.
Yep.
For women, because again, everybody's looking at her. Listen to this, as the queen.
Oh, yeah.
So she set the standard.
Yep.
All right, read on, Sister Catherine. I had to
Okay,
stop.
in verse 19, it says, we suggest that subject to your agreement, you issue a royal edict, a law of the Medes and the Persian that can never be changed, that Queen Vashti be forever banished from your presence, and that you choose another queen more worthy than she. When the decree was published throughout your great kingdom, husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will be respected by their wives. The king and all his aides thought this made good sense, so he followed Memucan's counsel and sent letters to all of his provinces in all the local languages, stressing that every man should rule his home and should assert his authority.
Wow. You know what I'm thinking of? I'm thinking of a couple of things that's running through the mind. I'm thinking of a recent event. Is really not talking about women, but I'm thinking about Colin Kaepernick, who took a stand, who kneeled and took a stand, even though he was banned from the NFL, not able to get a job, but in the long haul, it was for the benefit of all the players, particularly the black players. And there's a benefit in taking a stand when you're doing it for when there's a greater purpose. God will work on your behalf. Any other comments? Sister Angela, Sister Margaret, and y'all can speak up.
I just still say power to Queen Vashti.
Right.
And she was just tired, taking that position of, the man being the master over the woman.
Hey, look at this. Y'all look at verse 19. This is it. Therefore, it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed. You can't repeal it. That Vashti is never again to enter the presence of the king Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Strip her of her position of royalty. And all of this happened was setting Esther up for coming in and moving in and God working through her life, Queen Esther. But we can't see that right now. But we see there's a plan in this as well. God knows the plans that he has for what looks like defeat is really victory. That God has a plan, perfect plan for in this whole situation. Again, we go back and always think about the providence, the divine providence of God. God working through events and circumstances to fulfill his purpose. And we can see God working through this event and circumstance for his divine purpose in the land. But kudos, as we said, to Queen Vashti for standing up, even though it stripped her of her royal position and was going to give it to someone else. God still had a plan in the whole matter. Any other questions as we close out tonight? Chapter 1. So we learned that that this King Xerxes had all of this influence and was king over all of these provinces. He had influence, he had power, he had position, um, he had wealth, and he was over and had this cabinet. And the men set the laws at this time, which was not in favor of women having any type of authority or power or could not speak in any situation. So always keep that in mind, that empowerment or the women not having power at this time. And that Queen Vashti took a stand for what was right. So again, God will fight for you. God will be on your side. God will work through and for you to complete His purpose and plan in the land. Amen. So again, as we're going to attempt to study through Esther, I want the next for next week's lesson. Well, I want you to read chapter 2. Chapter 2, and we're going to be looking at how Queen Esther is going to be promoted at this time. At this time in this situation. So again, I think this is an exciting book. I think it's appropriate for the time that we're in. How God can use even a pandemic, a racial unrest, for His purposes to be fulfilled. And God is working through this. God is in the midst of this pandemic, in all of this. And it's going to be for His good and for His glory. God will get the glory out of this. Let us bow. Father, we thank you as we attempt to open up and learn of your word. Bless your people as we study the book of Esther. We pray, God, that it would be used, God, for purpose. Talks about Queen Vashti who had courage to stand up in the midst of what was wrong. And she said, look, I'm going to do what's right for me. Lord, we thank you and we honor you. We pray. Thank you for every hearer tonight as we continue to grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.
Yes, Lord.
This is our prayer. Bless all those in the land who have lost loved ones, comfort, strengthen, and heal, as only you can. Until we meet again, may the grace, peace, and love of God and the sweet communion of His Holy Spirit rest, rule, and abide henceforth and forevermore. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.